Good morning and welcome everyone to this conference of the Afro Middle East Centre. Let me make one another preliminary comment, and that is that at the Afro Middle East Centre we have decided, in terms of our nomenclature, that we will refer to the organization that we're talking about as the Islamic State Group. Not as ISIS or ISIL or not as Daesh, but as the Islamic State Group. We prefer to call people by what they would like to be called, but we're not entirely sure that the Islamic State Group is a state, so we add the word group to it. That's the way that we will refer to them, and we can have discussions and debates over lunch about whether it's the right way to refer to them, whether people might prefer other ways, etc. But that's how we would do it. We decided to have this conference on the Islamic State Group because of its tremendous significance in the world today. Certainly the region that we deal with as the Afro Middle East Centre, that we cover in terms of our research, the Middle East and North Africa region, and little bits of spillover on either side, but essentially the Middle East and North Africa region. The Islamic State Group has had already a tremendous impact on that region in the past couple of years. It also, of course, has had a tremendous impact globally. And I'm not just talking about the fact that we've seen bombs going off in Paris and Brussels and in other places, but it has had a huge impact globally. It has challenged accepted orthodoxy around the notion of states, around the division of states. Baghdadi famously said, when they symbolically destroyed the border between Iraq, or one of the borders between Iraq and Syria, that this is the end of Sykes-Picot. Whether that's true or not is another matter, but the point is that they have challenged these things that many of us have accepted, whether willingly or unwillingly, happily or unhappily, have accepted as being the framework within which we operate. Even those of us that might have wanted to change the framework, it is still the framework within which we operate. And so they have challenged that in a scale that goes beyond the Middle East and North Africa region. For us in South Africa, of course, there is a challenge around the question of the Islamic State Group. It refers firstly, of course, to the question of recruitment. We have had South Africans that have left our shores to go and join the Islamic State Group, or to live in the Islamic State, live in the Dawla, as they would say, to migrate, make hijrah. And we have had a few who have wanted to join the Islamic State Group to as fighters, for all kinds of reasons. And what we would like to do in this conference is unpack some of these various questions. Look at the question of whether this group that is claiming to be a state, whether it actually is a state or a pseudo-state or whatever it is. Whether it is, as it sometimes might claim for itself to be, whether it is a revolutionary movement, whether it is an insurgent movement. What are the characteristics of the governance structures that it has, which it claims is a state? How does it operate? We want to, in this conference, go beyond slogans and beyond conspiracy theories. We believe that as academics and as policymakers, which are in the main people that are sitting in this hall, as academics and policymakers, that if we want to talk about this group, then we need to understand what they are. What they are, where they come from, what do they believe, what drives them ideologically, philosophically, what are their objectives, what is the nature of the organization, the nature of the people who make up the organization, both in the area in which they are centered, as well as outside, people who join them, people who sympathize with them. One of the questions that I think we probably will not try to answer, although perhaps one or two speakers might, is whether the Islamic State Group is Islamic. For us in the Afro Middle East Centre, that's not really an important question. Perhaps for some people in the audience it is. But these are the kinds of issues that we want to tease out over the next 2 days, so that we might leave here with a deep understanding of what the Islamic State group is and what it is about. We will end the conference, however, on a note that is slightly different from simply the Islamic State group, and that is about talking about various responses to groups such as IS. And so we'll end off the conference with a discussion around what is these days called countering violent extremism, counterterrorism, those kinds of things. Looking at them broadly, how these things might have played out in various parts of the world, and then particularly in South Africa, and what that means for those of us who are South African. So that is the kind of broad spread that we want to cover in this conference. We hope that we will succeed in doing that. We have invited people to present to us over the next 2 days that are really experts in the field, but experts in the particular topics that they have been given, and we feel that we will all be thoroughly enriched by their participation and by their contributions on these various topics. So once again, thank you to them for accepting our invitation, and for some of them making a very long trek to get here. 1 or 2 people have traveled for 24 hours, someone for over 30 hours in order to be here. I know the world is supposed to be a smaller place these days, but airlines don't always think so. We will open the conference with our 2 keynote speakers. Let me apologize for those people who became very enthusiastic after reading the first draft of our program. Sheikh Rashid Al-Ghanouchi, the head of the An-Nahda party in Tunisia, cancelled last week and said that he could not make it because his party is very busy with other parties at the moment in Tunisia trying to ham out a unity government. And he didn't think it was appropriate for him to be out of the country at that time. So we accepted the explanation, and he is not here. The 2 keynote speakers that we do have, Wadah Khanfar and Minister David Matlobo. So let me briefly introduce the 2 of them. Before I introduce Wadah, let me just say also thank you to the AMEC team that put the conference together, and just to note that we are currently understaffed. One of our researchers has left to take up a very prestigious PhD scholarship, and the other has gone on Hajj. And so those speakers that had been communicating with Nick and Nazli, now you know why they're not here. So we're understaffed, and so the team that is here has worked extremely hard to make this possible. So everything that goes well with the conference, you can credit them for it. Anything that goes wrong with the conference, you can blame it on Wadah. Wadah is the president and co-founder of the Sharq Forum, which is an international think tank focused on political and economic development in the Arab world. He was also, from 2006 to 2011, the Director General of the Al Jazeera network. And the reason that we prefer to blame him for everything that goes wrong with AMEC is that he was one of the founders of AMEC in 1998, and its first executive director, until he left to take up this position at Al Jazeera. The next question I often get asked when I say that, Wadah, is, so is AMEC funded by the Qataris? The answer is no. Okay, just to clear the ground on that. Wadah will be our first speaker, and he will be followed by Minister David Matlobo. David Matlobo is currently the South African Minister of State Security. He and his family fled apartheid South Africa for Swaziland during the 1980s, went into exile, but he returned to complete his schooling and studied at the University of Zululand in what is now KwaZulu-Natal. He has a BSc Honours degree in biochemistry, and he worked at the Department of Water Affairs and Forestry in South Africa as a water scientist and as head of its transformation unit. Minister Matlobo was head of the Department for Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs in the Mpumalanga province until he was appointed as Minister of Parliament in 2014. In 2012, he was elected to the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress, South Africa's ruling party, where he still serves on the Peace and Stability Subcommittee. Last year, 2015, he was elected to the ANC's National Working Committee. The reason that we invited Minister Mahlobo to deliver a keynote address at this conference is that in the South African government, Minister Mahlobo is the lead person on dealing with any issues around the Islamic State group and what that means in the South African context. And we thought that it would be useful to hear from him from an official kind of South African perspective what that view is on this group. So let me first call to the podium Wadah, and he'll be followed by the Minister. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Good morning to you all. And thank you, Naeem, for that. Even a Sharq Forum, by the way, is not financed by the Qataris as well. So also we are an independent organization. And actually it gives me great pleasure to stand before you here in Pretoria, a country that I have spent 8 years of my career reporting about the truth and reconciliation, the transformation, and everything that happened in this country inspired me personally, and through Al Jazeera, I think inspired a huge amount of people in the Arab world. Today, the issue that we are talking about should be approached, in my opinion, from the following perspective. If we look at the rise of ISIS, as an accidental or mere accident in the region, we were going to be mistaken, of course. If we approach it as well as a religious phenomena or a sort of normal evolution of an Islamic discourse, we are going to be mistaken. I think there are three major approaches that I would like to introduce to you today. The first and the most important is related to the history, the political history of our region, the Middle East. I prefer to call that region a Sharq, which is the terminology that the forum, a Sharq Forum, is carrying. And the Sharq literally means the East, because it does actually describe something beyond the current Middle East as we know it. But anyway, from 1918 until today, the East or the Middle East has been dealt with from international powers as a theater, and a theater only. A theater for settling international balances, a theater of showing power from certain international powers, a theater of change, and even a theater for show, and a theater for experimental political operations. That way that the region has been dealt with during this period, which almost 100 years right now, 1 century, from 1916, the First World War and the sign of Sykes-Picot, and the division of the Ottoman Empire at that time, and the legacy of the Ottomans that have ended in the hands of the British and the French and the international powers, until today, that kind of approach was combined with something very toxic, which is, I am using you as a theater for my own sake and for my own pleasure, and you should act upon the script that I am writing for you, and you have no chance or right to amend or describe or behave in any way or form that might go beyond the terms and the role that I am giving you. That meant for 100 years that we do not have legitimate authorities. Legitimate in a sense, we do not have representatives from within the region who could introduce themselves as representatives of the masses or the public. Everyone knew, including governments in the region, that they are acting upon a script that has been written and has been given, handed over to them from the international powers. No one actually was concerned very much about the concept of legitimacy. I'm saying this with a lot of bitter feeling, because it seems to me that the crime towards the region was initially, of course, done in a way where the international powers are involved, but also when the puppet governments from within our region acted upon that particular role and continued acting, sometimes for the sake of necessities that have been imposed upon them, and sometimes for the sake of, just playing the role, so maybe in the future we can get something better. The division of the Arab world, the polarization between majorities and minorities, and all that legacy that emerged from the First World War kind of mentality actually continued to play a destructive role as far as the relationship between the public and the so-called governments in the region. So legitimate representation did not exist in a way. Governments had to resort to some form of oppression and dictatorship and authoritarian tools in order to impose order or to impose their own governance, since legitimacy on its own, the mutual social and political contract between the people and elite, did not really exist. Therefore, governments are not representing, the public do not trust the governments. Governments have to impose certain kind of rules in order to force people to follow orders, and therefore that kind of vicious circle led to a situation whereby with time we noticed from 1922 up to today, we notice rise of violence, decline of politics. The rise of violence came as a response to a lot of perceived grievances. One of them, lack of democracy, corruption, occupation, of course, of Palestine, and then the occupation that followed in many other parts of the Arab world, including the occupation of Iraq, and the international interference in every aspect of our life. That created anger, and the frustration was not handled by governments who are supposed to take care of the interest of nations, and therefore the public started to think of taking matters in their own hand. Normally, in a democratic society like here or anywhere else in the world, you will have people voicing their opinion, and then that might lead them to go to parliaments or wherever in order to convert this opinion into policies and policies into action. But in our case, that route was blocked. So therefore, if you complain, it doesn't really matter. If you just sit silent, nothing is going to change. You need to act upon it. And this kind of combination between the necessity to act and the feeling that there is rising grievances, rising feeling of oppression and marginalization within the Arab societies led to rise of violence, decline of politics, because politics anyway has never been really an option for a lot of people who would like to be effective. So that dilemma created rise of violence. I'm saying this why? Because you remember the first narrative that Al-Qaeda came up with in the 1994, 1995 was about the issue of international interference in the Arabian Peninsula. That was the founding statements of Al-Qaeda by Osama bin Laden. We are defending the holy sites from the Americans and the international interference after the first Iraqi war. And then there was political discourse combined with action, which is violence, until that moment. With the rise of interference in the region, reaching to 2001, of course, we have seen rise of violence, decline of politics in the discourse of Al-Qaeda. I would assume that Al-Qaeda 1.0 that was created by Osama bin Laden up to 2001 was converted or evolved into Al-Qaeda 2.0, where more international violence, less political rhetoric has started to emerge. And that was combined, of course, this second phase with the franchising Al-Qaeda across the Islamic world, and then the rise of versions of Al-Qaeda, local and domestic versions in Al-Maghrib al-Arabi, in Africa, in, of course, Somalia, and many other parts of the Islamic world. Then we came up to 2003. 2003 was a very important year for us in the region, more than 2001. Because 2003, we found a capital called Baghdad, which is historically the center of the Islamic civilization, occupied by the Americans. From 2003 onward, Al-Qaeda, even 2.0, Osama bin Laden was not good enough for the amount of frustration and anger that emerged in the region. So there is a new version that emerged out of 2 Al-Qaeda 2, which is Al-Qaeda 3, the roots of ISIS. We should always remember that the ISIS and its predecessors were Iraqis, always. Because that was the fault line of confrontation, the representation of the utmost feeling of anger and frustration and failure, and the utmost failure of legitimacy of Arab governments in preventing or aiding the Iraqis against the occupation. Because you should remember, of course all of us remember, that the war in Iraq happened in a way by the Americans and the coalition, but most of the Arab governments were either silent or at least involved in the coalition. That ruined whatever left of any feeling of legitimacy for the sake of utmost, necessity to act upon what you feel and you think. And then a tension was risen actually in Iraq between Al-Qaeda international and Al-Qaeda local. Al-Qaeda local was advocating more violence, including killing the Shia because they are collaborating with the Americans and many other things. And Al-Qaeda international in the form of Osama bin Laden was not allowing that. And we remember the famous speech of Osama 2006, where he actually condemned the actions of Al-Qaeda branch in Iraq by saying that you are killing a lot of people, and that we are not actually accepting. But anyway, that continued to exist in order to achieve something much more violent, which we call right now Daesh or ISIS or ISG. So again, we go back to this formula. That is important. Today, in order to eradicate ISIS, which is the fourth reincarnation of Al-Qaeda, we are having international alliance. And this international alliance, again, is using occupation and force and military power. Not Western, as it happened in 2003, but international. In a sense, there is the American alliance with the NATO and many other governments involved, and we have the Russians, of course, with the Iranians. Within this formula, I see that the current situation might be resolved. I personally think in the next few weeks, ISIS in Mosul will collapse. And I do believe that ISIS in Deir ez-Zor in Syria, of course, most likely is going to collapse as an entity controlling a territory. That's happening. I see it. Actually, I've just come from Istanbul, where I'm meeting some Iraqis from Mosul, discussing the future of Mosul after ISIS. I think that's going on in that track. But the question would continue to be, within this current international intervention and the security-only approach to the issue of ISIS, without a counter-narrative that might succeed the current situation or lessons taken from the previous encounters that we had with these groups, what form of violence are we going to see in the future? More sophisticated, more cruel, and it will learn from the mistakes of the previous versions. So I might see an end of ISIS, but I can't see an end of violence unless there is the second point, or the second approach to this matter, which I call it the counter-narrative. Where are we at this moment in time in producing alternatives to the public? Because you should remember that when ISIS emerged in Iraq, it emerged because of certain kind of grievances and feeling of oppression and marginalization from the Sunnis at that time. Are we resolving this matter? We are not. But we are talking about a situation whereby the victory of annihilating ISIS is going to lead to victorious and defeated. And the victorious are the same people actually who were the reason for the crisis itself. And the defeated were the same people who were oppressed. So again, we are going to entrench the feeling of marginalization and oppression, and those who will in the next generation take the guns again, they are going to take it with much more brutality and much more even maybe learning from the lessons of the past. The counter narrative is important politically. We are not introducing to the region any hope. Since the decline of the Arab Spring, and the Arab Spring was a counter narrative, very strong counter narrative to the concept of Al-Qaeda. And we remember, all of us remember, 2011, 2012, Al-Qaeda itself it ceased to be attractive to anyone. In fact, Osama bin Laden, in one of his speeches, he used the terminology, the blessed Arab Spring. I mean, he started even advocating a march towards democracy, or he was forced to say so, because the majority of the grassroots have taken on their shoulders a democratic track towards change rather than violence that Al-Qaeda was advocating. So, since the decline of the Arab Spring, the Egyptian coup, and after that the civil war happening right now in Yemen, and also the continuous confrontation in Syria, and of course in Iraq, and across the region, what is the counter narrative? The counter narrative: we are going to destroy ISIS, but we are going to keep the authoritarian, bloody dictators ruling this region. You have no choice but to live under either ISIS or to live under dictatorships and corruption. And the dictatorships of today are matching ISIS with violence, by the way, because we have tens of thousands of people in jail, we have a lot of killing, we have a lot of blood, we have people in Syria and across the region suffering from regimes more than they are suffering from groups like that. So what is the counter narrative? How are we going to convince the masses that the future could be hopeful, and therefore you don't need to join groups like ISIS and others, and you can always struggle politically for a much better future? Because whoever would like to be politician now, he can end in jail or executed or killed. Therefore, there is a major problem on the international society, South Africa in particular. And this is why I say this, because from the legacy of South Africa, you had a sort of a status in the hearts of the Arabs. And the major narrative of South Africa is about democracy and reconciliation, societal reconciliation, and about transformation to democracy, and about the fact that you were able to bridge the divide between various groups within the society. That is a legacy that enables South Africa to play a role as far as a counter-narrative is concerned in our region. And I think we should not be seen as part of international effort, because international effort in fighting ISIS, or international effort in dividing the Middle East, or international effort in creating a Kurdish territory, or creating whatever territory, or dividing Syria and Iraq, all that is dismissed by the people in the region as international interference, as one-sided approach, and is not going to give stability. What can give stability is concentration on the concept of democracy and the transformation and reconciliation. The third approach, and that's also very important for all of us, we Muslims now, there is a third element important to say. I would say we have a strong presence in history. And history has not been, for the last 400 years or 300 years, has never been kind to us. In a way, there was a decline in the empire that Muslims have built. A sophisticated, scientific, cultural, philosophical aspects were actually dominant within the world. And then there was a huge decline. We continue to live in a past, in a way. Of course, always history is important to take lessons from, but very toxic to dwell in. And some of us are still dwelling in history. In a sense, when we are trying to prescribe solutions for the reality or for the future, the only way that we could approach reality or the future is through looking into the past and the previous examples that existed in our history or in the glorious past in order to replicate. Of course, that is not going to work. I think intellectuals within the Muslim world should embark on a journey of, I'm not speaking about reforming Islamic thinking. Islam is a great religion like any other religion. It's not a matter of reforming Islam. I think what we are trying to do is to open the following narrative within the Islamic thinking. Islam is about the future, not the past. Islam is about, since Muhammad, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that he is the Prophet for all humanity until the end of time, that is a futuristic statement. It's not a statement about the past or the present. So if we take that into coordination, then our relationship with our texts our relationship with our history, our relationship with the role models that we are following is going to shift from following that literally within its historical context into rehabilitating the values that emerged from there to dwell in the present and in the future. And that will stop any form of radicalization, or at least will stop these groups from using the text and rehabilitating their thing, or using that for their own legitimate presence within us. I am reading some of the texts that ISIS is producing, religious texts. It is anti-orthodoxy. It has nothing to do with the Islamic text that our scholars in Islam have produced. They are producing their own version. But what is common between them and others, they are using the same text. So they go to one particular verse or ayah or hadith, and they use that in order to support their argument. While the other scholars in Islam have used the same text, but in another direction. So we need to deprive them from this kind of legitimate reason of using the text in order to introduce themselves. And I see, just to conclude, I am hopeful that the rise of so much tension in the Middle East and the Islamic world, be it ISIS or be it the situation within the Arab governments now in Syria and in Iraq and Yemen and in Libya and wherever you are going, I see and sense and feel that this is the moment of a transformation that we have been hoping for, of course without the blood. We have been hoping to change our reality. And unfortunately, change is not easy. It's not going to be free of charge. We are going to spend, it seems to me, a lot of effort and sometimes blood in order to create that particular change. Nations did that before us. The Europeans, who have the great democratic freedoms of today, are a result of the 30 years religious war in the 17th century and a result of international wars, the First International War, Second World War. And therefore, I can't see the current situation as an end. It is a moment of a transition towards something else. What we need, all our friends in the world, or allies who are concerned about the region and concerned about themselves, because as you see internationally, as Naeem spoke about now, everywhere, including South Africa, they will be affected by the current situation in the Middle East. What we need is, we need to work on the future. We need to really create an imagination, a debate, a dialogue, narrative about the future, where our young people feel that the future could be possible to live without the current violence that we are witnessing. So we need a place to migrate. I use the word, not reform, I use migration. We need to migrate from the reality into another reality. Before you migrate, you need to describe to the migrant, where is he heading? What kind of reality is going to encounter? And then transfer him to the next phase of existence, rather than continuing to dwell within small narratives of today and continue to debate and discuss small issues that are affecting our mind. Then, second, our region must migrate from being a theater into having a center of action. I am hopeful today, more than maybe last month, that the approach that Turkey is taking towards Iran and Russia is helpful. I see and I follow the statements and the visits that Mr. Erdogan did to Russia, and the visits to Iran and the counter visits to Iran in a positive way. There are two important countries in the region that are going eventually to define the output of the situation in Syria and the output of the situation in Iraq: Iran and Turkey. One of them alone cannot do this. Of course, Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Arab world as well. But the most important element, in my opinion, every one of them has reached the following conclusion: there is no way that I can win 100%. Yemen, we are not going to win in Yemen. A very clear cut solution. We have reached a point of deadlock. In Syria, no party is going to win. Neither the Russians and the Iranians on one hand, and the regime with them, or the Qataris, Saudis, and the Gulf states plus Turkey on the other hand. No one is going to win a final victory. And in Iraq, it's the birthplace of Al-Qaeda 2.0 and ISIS. It will never be resolved unless these powers sit together. So we are advocating a center of gravity within the region. I think the Turks are more than ever convinced today, especially after the failed coup that happened in Syria and Turkey. They are convinced more than ever that the Americans and the Western Europeans actually have their own interest, and again they need Turkey to be a theater rather than Turkey to be a state that has a say within the region. Of course, they have done the same with Iran for the last 20 years as well. So, and the Iranians today are more convinced than ever that the Russians would like to use the Middle East as a theater. And this is why yesterday and the day before yesterday, the Iranians stopped using the Hamadan because they said it publicly. The Russians are using it as show. It is a show. For the Russians, it is a show. Syria, for them, it is a show. They have to say to the Americans and to the world, nothing can be done without our consent, and we are as equal as the Americans to any international conflict. So please respect that and sit with us on the table on Ukraine, on East Europe, and everything else. We have no chance to introduce a stable situation in the Middle East, balanced one, unless these countries sit together and convinced to work together. I feel South Africa again could play a major role in bridging this divide, not taking a stance against anyone, but at least facilitating a model where a regional center of gravity, a regional understanding could resolve the conflicts in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, and in North Africa in a way that might lead to a narrative again that is hopeful about a future which is democratic, which is free, which is not corrupt. And again, I say, I am hopeful. I have not lost hope during this last few years, and I think we are steadily moving towards something that could work. But that something which could work will be again legitimate and will be reasonable from within the region itself. Thank you very much.